Welcome to the Yeoman Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Graham. On Yeoman, I'll speak with people who build and grow things, people who create art, and people who think about community, meaning, and purpose. Today is Wednesday, March 20th, and this afternoon I'm joined by Ashley Fitzgerald. Ashley is an environmental sociologist, a writer, a teacher, and the co-founder and co-director with her husband, Patrick, of Rizoma Field School. Rizoma leads experiential learning trips in Uruguay and the Midwestern United States, and also offers a handful of self-directed introductory courses on homesteading and homeschooling. Ashley's writing has been published in Unheard, The American Conservative, Spectator, and many other places. She is one of the co-founders and hosts of the Doomer Optimism podcast. And I should note that Ashley has published a great deal of work for a long time. And if you search for it, you'll find much of it under her maiden name, Ashley Colby. You can find her on Twitter, where I first found her, at Rizoma School with a Z. The Rizoma Field School website is just that, rizomafieldschool.com. And do also check out the Doomer Optimism podcast. Ashley, who has lived a number of lives in a number of places, is, and I'm quoting here, now focused on doing anything I can to foment local, decentralized networks of people who can get us to the next iteration of society and fast. Welcome, Ashley. I am delighted to finally meet you.
Yeah, it's so good to meet you. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So in one of your 2022 articles for Front Porch Republic, an outfit, I don't know, what do we call Front Porch Republic?
Yeah, publication, but also, I think like network of people.
So I highly recommend the Front Porch Republic. Y'all check it out. But you wrote in 2022 there, our solutions are not global in nature. They might not even be national in nature. It asks individuals to get involved at the lowest possible scale in church and on school boards, to be productive in the home and show up in a community as ways to build an emergent, virtuous, and meaningful life now. You referred to this solution as, quote, fundamentally a Wendell-Berry conservatism, end quote. A lot of your writing, and I think your work as well, circles around this broad theme: community, presence, subsidiarity. So I think the best place for me to start is to ask, what is this problem in need of this solution?
Right. Okay. So I would say broadly, the problem is it's kind of a post-industrial homogenous globalization that just sort of makes, in the biggest sense, the suggestion is that either the state or the market are the main places where action is possible in our world. And it's a sort of post-industrial mindset that has really only come about after like super hyper advanced, turbo capitalism and hyper advanced post-industrial revolution, which makes it so that, we're increasingly have the same culture around the world. We're increasingly have the same kind of products. The state is really large. The states are really large. We kind of think of power and agency just like in terms of, for example, in the US, the presidency, like the presidential election is the only kind of election that people pay attention to. And so broadly, the problem is just, it's like an overscaled problem. And it's a problem of thinking that, I think I would argue that because of it's pretty much a direct line between cheap energy and people's ability to not be interdependent. So to be independent, meaning they can just basically expect that the market will solve their material needs. And basically we have enough energy and wealth that's more or less the case in a lot of the developed world, where you don't have to rely on your neighbors. You could just buy everything. And then, we're looking to the state to enforce civic norms. So, instead of like enforcing norms and morality between neighbors, you just kind of look to this apparatus of the state to enforce it via laws in this
when you say
way.
Turbo capitalism, can you expand on that a bit? I
Yeah,
gather you relate to the abundance of the kind of the relatively new abundance of energy, but or I'll let you. I'd love to hear your words on what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I just mean a kind of super expansive, hyper tech, hyper global free market and free market that is then more or less not actually free because it's a lot of the most extreme biggest actors, most global actors and most destructive market actors are like subsidized by the state. So it's just kind of this hyper state, overscaled market, like these overscaled actors, industry actors that that have a lot of agency and are the sort of like the locus of where people much of their life is governed by those actors basically. And so the solution is to think about the ways in which we can first of all recognize that that's the case, that so much of our life is governed by these super overscaled, like not human scaled institutions, and the ways in which we can resist that but creatively and in a way that garners meaning. And so one other thing I'll just say at what is the problem is a lot of this hyperscale has on the one hand created a huge amount of material abundance and a huge amount of even safety. Like people say that there's like issues with crime and that kind of thing, but relative to most of human history, we have a lot of safety and we have a lot of material abundance. However, we're missing a lot of interdependence and meaning and purpose and connection to nature and feeling like our life goal is tangible and tractable, and so it's a really difficult problem to face because people will say, oh, well, do you want to just go back to a world in which we don't have material abundance and people, we had a high infant mortality rate? No, of course not. But it is good to at least recognize that part of the problem is a real disconnect. The crisis of meaning is a real thing and it does exist. And it's partially related to this overabundance, basically.
Yeah. Does anyone really, I'm going to talk about the question of abundance, but like setting that aside for a second, does anybody really argue about this sort of the lack of, this inchoate feeling of, not any real meaning, community, attachment, all those things? Like this is something everybody, whatever their persuasion, I just don't think people would argue that. Many people would argue with that, or reasonable people would not.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people would say like have had some, even Americans have had an ongoing, especially working class Americans have had an ongoing like unbroken culture and unbroken interdependence and reliance upon community, or connection to civic organizations or connection to churches. So I do think that there is a subset of people for whom a lot of this stuff didn't go away. But yeah, then there's a whole other like source of issue, which is something that I could talk about at length, which is if you come from a place like that has some, amount of interdependence and community cohesion, if you are at all gifted, you are told basically to go away from it.
Right.
And so that's another problem. It's not just like, because those places do still exist. And I'm like seeing my own home place with new eyes in this way. But then you're also kind of like told you need to go achieve something somewhere else. And then the meaninglessness and the ennui kicks in because you're, following what you're told to do, which is go to the best universities, get the highest degrees you can get, get the most well-paying job you can get. And then, you're sort of isolated with the other upper middle class high achievers.
So I want to come back to you've recently had some dramatic moves in your life for Uruguay and then back to, are you in Chicago proper?
I'm in Chicago. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In Chicago proper. Yeah.
And I want to come back to that. But I want to stay on this topic of like, things have changed and call it turbo capitalism. I'm kind of inclined to call it corporatism is
Yeah.
is what I think are people sort of on the kind of, I don't view free market as a bad term, but the free market people tend to view corporatism or cronyism or those things as
Hmm.
a really bad thing. And I think maybe we might mean the same thing when we use those terms. But
Yeah.
anyway, coming back to that, like what has changed, you suggested a solution, and I love the term Wendellberry conservatism. And in that it's sort of like localism or subsidiarity or whatever one might call it, but like whatever it was, knowing who Wendell Berry is and reading his writings, I immediately understood what you meant by that. And it seems to me like that was the norm not long ago, like not
Yeah. Right.
very long ago, certainly in my grandparents' childhood at the very least. Uh,
Yep.
and I even, I remember this 1970s very, I was a child then, but I remember them and visiting my family in rural Georgia. I definitely like that was a very real thing. It was there at
Yeah.
the time. It was not long ago. And I wonder if people, well, certainly some people did because they wrote about it, Wendell Berry and people before him too. But I think most people didn't even notice it. It was like fish in water. And why do you think, this is probably a really long, this is a really long answer to this question, but why do you think those community bonds are so frayed? Like, would you pin it on energy abundance? You referred to that a couple times.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that it just is like, it's this cycle that one thing leads to another, and you can't even, a lot of ink has been spilled on trying to like roll it back, or at what point would you need to roll these things back, and what particular things should you roll back, and then, but I would argue that like a lot of the connections, they're all connected to one another. You can't just roll back one thing and then you're going to get like the whole social context that existed before this kind of abundance. But I would argue that just massive energy abundance then kind of just allowed for certain social structures to develop that basically just changed the whole tenor of society. And in so many ways, like it's just like you can't even describe it. There's so many examples of this in so many aspects of life. I mean, just thinking about like, let's just take feminism, for example, like that is women working out of the home is 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 just made possible by such an extreme abundance that you then have, I guess you're going to put all these things, all these kids in daycare, into institutions. You've got these oversized institutions. You start to just think of everything in terms of the marketplace. How much money can my family earn? How much can we consume? Then it starts to become like everyone's main goal is to get as big of a house as possible and consume as much as possible. And you can't really blame people. It's such a tricky issue. You can't really blame people for wanting material abundance, especially coming from really hard times or hard backgrounds. You can't really blame people for seeing that as a relief to their plight. But then it gets to a point where you almost forget what you forgot, or people who are born at a certain age just never knew it. And that to me is the real crux, is for a lot of us who have some memories of this kind of holistic experience of a community that's functional, that has community ties, that has interdependence, neighborliness, like a concern for the local. It's something you remember, but for our kids, maybe some of them have never experienced it. They've only experienced a world in which they live in the suburbs and everyone just cares about getting the next tech gadget, and they've been raised on iPads, and that's just their whole life. And so I try to say these sort of things like, remember when I got into so much trouble recently, like remember when we lived in a world that was full of abundant water fountains. And people got really mad at me about this, but it was basically like everyone walks around now with a water bottle, but it used to be the case that you would go to public places and there was water fountain, and that is actually a sign of a healthy society that cares about the public sphere, that cares about its citizens enough to provide this abundant, fresh, clean water access in wherever you went, so that it didn't have to be individualized and privatized
Do you
to
think
your own water bottle.
do you think maybe there's also let's see, how can I say this on that issue? And I did appreciate your comment, and like my kids are bigger now, so it's not so much of a thing, but I just
Yeah.
remember we would refer to it as the water bottle industrial complex. Like, what is going on with all
Why?
these
And
water
then
bottles?
all these kids also have to have like a fancy water bottle. They can't
Oh
just have
yeah, and
like
then
whatever. It
there's
has to be
who's
like
got to get the
a
greatest
nice
one?
one, a
Yeah,
name brand. And then
yeah.
it's like, where's your water bottle? And everybody's bringing it to every single thing, and they're
Oh yeah.
bringing it to every. And to me, I'm just like, I remember a time in which I would have to either wait in between my chance to go to the lineup, at school, where we would go to the bathroom and then we'd line up and use the water fountain and go back into the classroom. Or it was like something that was accessible and abundant. So that's just like one tiny example that sounds really silly,
So
but people don't even remember a world. A lot of these Zoomers, like, who got mad at me, don't even remember a world in which that was the case. And so they're just like, water fountains are disgusting. What are you talking about? And,
so
I'm
that's
trying to
my
make the
daughter's
case.
take.
Yeah.
Like, it's totally my daughter's take. And in her defense, I've seen the water fountains that are available to her, and they are kind of disgusting. Like,
Yeah.
it's this reinforcing cycle.
Yes,
Well,
exactly.
everybody's going to bring their own water bottle, so we don't need to clean the water. We don't need to tend to the
Yes.
infrastructure that we have, and so we
Yeah.
will let our community infrastructure erode while people try to control everything about their own environment, and then their trust in the community further erodes because they witness or they experience the lack of being able to get what they need from the community. It's a
Yeah,
terrible
and actually
cycle.
this is a pretty profound point, and I talked about this a lot in my dissertation. There is a book, I think his name is Thomas Szas, Szas, Z. So it was two SZs in a row. But
Wow,
I
that's a
think it was,
cool
yeah,
palindrome name.
he wrote I think it was like consuming our way to safety or buying our way to safety or something like that. And it was basically about, I think it was about water bottles. And I think it was about organic milk, but I remember it was about like, we can just buy, there's this new, like, it's almost like an individualistic libertarian sense of like, I'm going to remain safe by protecting my family from the dangers of industrial food. And of course, I'm not going to like fault people for buying organic. But if you look at it holistically, we are increasingly moving out of the public sphere and out of the desire to engage in our civic duty to, like, for example, legislate clean food, and instead just personalizing and individualizing this responsibility to the point that the public sphere then gets atrophied, because everyone's just like, I'll just filter my water at home and carry around a water bottle. I'll grow my own food. And so it's weird
Do you
because
think one came before the other? Like, do you think the
I think probably, like, it probably came a point where people were like, these systems are so outscaled and I'm so outnumbered that I'm just going to do this. And I don't fault people for that either. I do it too. But it's just like recognizing that, a robust public sphere is really the solution to these things. And you do, and then this ties into like the move back to Chicago too, like, at a certain point, if you keep retreating and retreating and retreating, the whole public sphere crumbles. Like, at a certain point, all of these institutions get hollowed out, and you're just a family alone, kind of like trying to keep your fence high and keep your family safe against the barbarians of like the world out there, the scary, dangerous, icky water fountain world. And like in reality, what we ought to be doing, to the extent possible, and I know it's hard, these things are super overscaled, but we ought to be really engaging with those institutions to the extent that we can, and not ceding them, and not ceding all the power and emptying them out and letting them fail.
So I agree with all that. And my sense is that the institutions have been hyperscaled to the point where individuals don't feel like they can have a meaningful influence on them. And
Yeah.
part of the retreat from engagement in them is a reaction to kind of the institutionalism of modernity, like everything being like institutions being enormous and
Yeah.
and and impenetrable in a way, and difficult. I mean, like I have 1 foot in a rural part of the Southeast, and then another foot firmly, deeply in the city of Atlanta. I live here in Midtown Atlanta, and I got a letter from the Jackson County, North Carolina, tax assessor's office. In Jackson County is where property in the mountains is, and it was kind of confusing. Like I didn't know exactly what I was like. Was I supposed to pay him something? Was I not? It wasn't obvious, and it was like, here's the hours for a phone, and I called him up, and it was like 4:57 on a Friday, and I called him up, and someone answers like, "Hello, this is Julie, Jackson County Assessor's Office." Like, "Hey, my name's Jeff Graham. I got a letter from you guys, and it's just not obvious to me what I'm supposed to do. And can you just connect me with whoever I should talk to?" And she's like, "Oh, I can help you with that. You're Jeff. You're Jeff with a G, right?" She knew who I was.
Yeah.
And she immediately helped me, and I kind of, it was done. It's totally done. It was the easiest, delightful conversation, totally fun. I made a friend, and I hung up the phone, and I was like, "Wow, I got to say, as a crazy anarcho
Yeah.
libertarian Luddite-ish guy, whatever I am,
Yeah.
if all my experiences with our public institutions were like that, there'd be far fewer libertarians."
Yeah, no, exactly. And this is really, like, I think the crux of where I'm focused at the moment, and what probably will continue to be for a long time, and have been in my iteration, my past lives, as you said. But where to focus our energies, where to inject our agency and our attention is a really big question, and a difficult question. And I would say I'm writing a book on prepping with a military guy named Chris Ellis, and he says fight local, win local. And his big thing is, you really have to think about where your attention and agency will matter. And so if you think about like your local tax assessor's office, you're like making a relationship there, just having that relationship and being cordial with those people is not going to be a bad thing for you. It's going to be nice to know somebody and to be oh, hey, I talked to you before. There's certain institutions that are actually, first of all, not only not beyond saving, but also like dying for new attention and injection of like participation. And I think a lot of people kind of lump in, the federal government and, the Department of the Interior as the same as my local public school, but they're just simply not. Your local civic organization, your local church, like even like something, this sounds really stupid, but like coaching your kids' little league team, these kinds of things, like these are where we need warm bodies, like, and not just warm, people who care, who are intentional, who are thoughtful about what they're doing and why they're doing it and how they're doing it. They're connecting to other members of the community, which then gives you power. It's not just volunteering. It's not just sucking from you, like getting those relationships going, making a name for yourself. This is the kind of interdependence that really grants your family power and access to things, and not in a not insignificant way, I would argue. So it is beneficial to everybody involved. But, I think a lot of people do see these major institutions and just think like, I can't make any difference. But I'm experiencing quite a bit of the opposite, but you really have to figure out where and what.
So on that, experiencing the opposite, I am too. And I have to say that I imagine this is not a conversation my great grandparents ever had. Like it was just, it existed. It was, and it was not ever anything they felt like they lost or their parents or grandparents lost or whatever. But I do feel like this, whatever whatever we might call it. And I'm not entirely satisfied with the term as much as I love it, Wendell-Berry conservatism. But whatever it is called, I feel like it's having a moment. Do you?
Yeah.
It's not like, we're the only two people on the planet who are interested in this. It feels like it's kind of a big deal right now.
I personally think there are some really flashy solutions out there, and there always will be, and like especially in this like height of industrialism, like we've really never before in human history had this much wealth and this much like power and literally energy.
I do kind of want, I think you might be, I do kind of, if we have time, I want to talk about the Chris Smage, is that how you pronounce his name?
Yeah, Chris Smage.
And George
Monbiot.
I like that whole thing, which I think is totally bizarre to me. Like,
so taking them as an example,
or maybe people probably don't know what that is. So if you,
I'll give a brief rundown. It's very simple. So Chris Smage is saying basically, and I agree with him, if you look at any graph of like energy use, like we have used so much energy, more energy than we've ever used in human history before. And that's unlocked all sorts of technologies and all sorts of like complexity, and, population and the ability to ship things around the globe. And then now we're sort of reliant upon that system that is just getting increasingly bigger and bigger. I mean, if you think about farms, like farms are just getting bigger and bigger because the machines to be able to plant and harvest them are just getting bigger and bigger. It's require more and more energy. And this obviously is just not sustainable, like literally by any, physics definition of physics. And also like, even if we were to move to nuclear power, these diesel powered tractors that are like gigantic, and you've got one farmer on 10,000 acres, they cannot become electric. They will not become electric. Something else will happen. So, okay, what will happen? And Chris Smage wrote a book called Small Farm Future. And he basically says, like, for all of human history, we've had a lot more people sharing the burden of like food and fiber and medicine production. Like this is just a normal part of human history. People had these skills. Everyone doesn't have to be a subsistence farmer, but you would people would have a kitchen garden and they'd have chickens and they'd have these skills and they'd know how to put things up and they know how to, transform food, and everybody would kind of share that burden, and you just have a lot more people on the land. George Monbiot is this writer for The Guardian, and he basically argues that we can just use technology to make basically like a protein slurry in a lab. And we can just eat that, and we can all move to the cities, and we can leave nature to wild animals, and we can eradicate farms and agriculture, which is completely insane. Like, it's just like by any metric insane. And then Chris wrote a whole rebuttal book about saying no to a farm-free future, and like actually ran Monbiot's numbers and proved that like it's energetically impossible. But it doesn't matter, because going back to my original point and your original question, there are a lot of flashy solutions out there that a lot of people are caught up in. And I would say like there are for sure, like there's accelerationism, there's Bitcoin, there's every number, there's let's go to Mars, let's become a multiplanetary species. Like there's, people who are like hyper into nuclear power, which that's the one that I'm like, I'm open to that to make the landing a little softer for us moderns. But, there's this lab food eco-modernism, like let's just every problem we have will just be solved by technology, some advanced technology.
Yeah,
like,
on the urbanism, your friend of mine, Stu Mizan, refers to that as gizmo green. It's like not really
gizmo green. I love that. Yeah, that's perfect. And so every new thing will just solve the problem. There's going to be no side effects to any of that. Like no issue at all for having corporations, giant lab corporations making all of our food and relying on that. It'll be
patented. They'll be protected in IP, but with their IP.
Yes, but according to Monbiot, we'll have strong unions, and that'll be the way in which they'll be kept in balance. So yeah, that's great. So anyways, there's all of these like whiz bang techno solutions, I would say, out there. But then I think there's just a lot, and increasingly people who just see that that's just fake. Like that the argumentation is the more, if you ever dig into it at any point, and where I got into it is through food and ag. And basically like from a city, but then I, moved to Uruguay and spent some time in rural areas. And I'm being told as a good environmentalist, do not eat meat. Animal agriculture is horrible for the environment, like categorically horrible. And then I'm simultaneously living next to like a row crop farm that sprays chemicals all over, and also next to like an animal ag farm that does like rotational grazing. And I just started to see like, where are these numbers coming from? Like how are these conclusions being drawn that animals are categorically bad? And then I just started digging into it further and saw that a lot of those numbers are completely cooked and inaccurate, just because they have some sort of ideological background that they think like livestock needs to be eradicated because maybe they're a vegan or that kind of thing. And then these lies just keep getting repeated. And so anyways, I would say like people want more of the same. They want more. A lot of people want simple solutions that don't require them to make any sacrifice or do anything differently, even while they're also feeling pretty miserable living the way that they do. But they can't really imagine that living in a way that requires a little bit more self-reliance and active engagement would bring them some of that meaning that they're looking for. But then there are these other people who have kind of just reached a wall and seen through that and just say, so I do agree with you. I think there are people out there who are seeing this and saying like, I can't do this anymore. I need to find, a different solution.
And you may not even remember this, but I remember it. I can't remember how long ago it was. There's a yogurt commercial. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do.
A yogurt commercial cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of like, what's the term? It's not.
What is it? I think it's called solar punk.
Solar punk. Was it solar punk? And it painted this picture of the future, and I'll link to it in the show notes because it's a really beautiful picture and a really well done commercial by a yogurt company, sort of trying to paint a picture of an optimistic future with regard to agriculture and its place within our ecosystem. And it had this beautiful sort of small techno farm that had robots picking things and happy workers and all kinds of stuff. And then you could see in the background this beautiful walkable city that was in the far background beyond the farm, but somewhat close. There was no sprawl, there was no industrial agriculture. It was all cool, and I mean, I don't think it's going to work. The optimist in me doesn't think it's going to look like that. Like, I think the robots are kind of silly, and I don't, and I think those little blimp things they had that were capturing wind were kind of neato. Yeah. But I don't think it's crazy to think that we may find ourselves back in that direction. I mean, there's a lot of things that I think we just won't be able to afford to keep doing that are totally benefit very large organizations at the expense of small ones. Yeah. And I think we're just eventually going to have to stop doing that, whether we do it because we go bankrupt or whether we do it because people have enough foresight. It's going to be one of the two.
Well, it's funny because like my podcast, Doomer Optimism, originally came about because like Jason, the co-founder, and I were just kind of joking about how like if you see the doom, you see within that the seeds of the optimism. And so like we were arguing things like, like for example, I did some field work with the Earthship builders, and that's like a kind of building that came out of New Mexico. This really weird guy, Michael Reynolds, built a house out of beer cans in the 70s, and then he was like called himself the garbage warrior, and he was just like, he just like kept experimenting with building structures until he got to what is now the current Earthship model, but there's multiple different models, and it's basically like making it passive solar heating and having electricity generation and having sanitation within the building, like gray water gardens and this kind of thing. And it's so cool. And I just think like in a low energy future, or low resource or transformed energy, even, because obviously like coal and oil, these things are not infinite. Even if they were lasted for 1,000 years, they're still not infinite things. They take a long time to develop. And so even if you're switching over to nuclear, it's going to look totally different. Totally transformed energy future. These kinds of experiments are in fact giving us a head start on how to live with this combination of we don't have to roll back all the technology we've developed over the last 200 or 300 years. Like, we can keep that knowledge of a lot of the things. Some of it will be obsolete outside of a super high energy future. Like, for example, there are some factories that just require constant, huge inputs of energy. Like, okay, those machines, I'm sorry, we invented them. They lasted for 50 years utility. Now they're going away. But there are plenty of simple machines. And, this Luddite leaning thing I have, on the one hand, I'm a Luddite, but on the other hand, like, I appreciate so many simple machines, but I just think it's been so overscaled. It's going back to that comment of like, we forgot what we forgot. Like, we're so dependent on like Nest thermometer, like all of this super high tech stuff that nobody like remembers how to even interact with.
I tried to install an old school. I wanted to put old school thermostats in our house, and the HVAC guys were like, "Not allowed. Can't do it."
I know. And then
like, can I? Because they're so easy and they never break, and you just
I know, and it becomes this thing where like then you're like, this is where we interact, I think, with some of these like more working class guys who are like, I want my machines and I want to be in control of them and be able to like repair them. And there's this whole right to repair stuff.
Sure,
and like we got these older vehicles so that we, didn't have some of these new compute, like they're throwing out entirely new cars because some computer broke on it and it's just too interconnected in the whole vehicle system for the vehicle to work. So they're throwing out like basically perfectly good vehicles because they over engineered like the complexity in the computers. It's idiotic and such a waste. And so for me, like I'm pro tech, but it's got to be appropriate technology. You know what I mean?
I think I love that right to repair movement. When I think about the costs of, my general take is that humans are pretty innovative, and they're going to figure out the energy stuff. Like I don't see our constraints becoming energy related. The technology that is under development with regard to small scale nuclear is really, there's a lot of people working hard on that topic. I think it's probably kind of promising. So I imagine we're going to have the future I see with regard to energy, like I know anything, but I imagine there's going to be a lot more energy production that's a lot more local.
That would be cool.
Yeah, and small scale molten salt reactor, clean nuclear energy, safe nuclear energy is probably going to be a thing. Maybe not in 10 years, but probably in 30. Yeah. And that would change a lot about how we get energy. But when I think about the costs, I'm like, interstate highway system, like, no, that's either the cost to drive on that thing is going way up or they're going away. Probably the cost is going to go way up. And when I think about, okay, what sort of businesses exist now that are totally dependent on that? And what kind of businesses can exist independent of that? I think, at least I make this argument. Some people agree with me, some disagree, but I just don't think big box retailers, I don't think you can operate at scale or sell your products very far from where they're made, certainly not perishable ones, without the interstate highway system. And that's like the largest, it's the largest human project in the history of the world. Like we've spent more money on that than I'm serious than like the
Yeah,
pyramids,
yeah, yeah,
or the Manhattan Project or whatever. And like
yeah.
it's expensive, and I think that's probably going. That actually, I'm actually excited about the prospect of that going away.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know. I get that would be a path to go. But I'm kind of optimistic about that. You know, that commercial, that yogurt commercial thing. Like, it's not going to look exactly like that, but it's going to be cool.
Something like it.
Could
Yeah, and
be,
actually,
yeah,
and I like love this is so similarly to the question about where to spend our agency, in what institutions, in what
yeah.
local institutions to spend our agency. I would say it's also super interesting to me to look at people who are experimenting with appropriate and small tech and decentralized tech and local examples of doing low tech well. And I like we had a guy on, and I just wish there was more of this too, like localized manufacturing, to the point where people like could get a plan to build something for local manufacturing. I think it was a
I,
distillery was the example that
yeah.
he was doing, but
Well, so
and
like 3D printing is an area I'm like totally excited about. Like,
yeah,
what can
right.
that do for you on local manufacturing, or to preserve the things that you already preserve and improve the things you already have.
Yeah, and
It's
then
pretty
the
fun.
other thing that I love and have always loved and am excited about is um I think my friend Andy was the one who said this first, canal futurism. Like I love canals. I love the idea of canals. I traveled a lot in between college and grad school,
Yeah.
and I've been to a lot of like medieval or ancient cities that have intact canals, and they are just gorgeous
Oh yeah.
and
Yeah.
like moving
Charleston,
things
South
by it.
Carolina it used to be a canal city.
Right. And then obviously, in Holland there like a whole canal culture, but I was in China, there's like China, Japan, like there's all these canal towns and they're just gorgeous. And then, basically the infrastructure is built around the canals because it's so low energy to move things that way. And it's also so human scaled. And to me, like that's the exciting question is like, what of these technologies are human scaled and sort of add to the quality of our life as opposed to detracting, which is what a lot of the technology, super hyper technology that has come out recently does. It really detracts from our quality of life, and people know it. They know it's hijacking like their dopamine receptors. They're still
Hmm.
addicted to it, and they're saying like, I need to get better habits. And to me, like it's almost an act of resistance to think
Totally.
like, how can we use this technology to our benefit and build it for our own kids' future? Like, I feel so bad for some of these kids who are they're lab rats. They're lab rats in a high tech world that
I,
is absolutely hijacking
I think they
them if
know.
their parents aren't intentional.
I think they know, or I would say this about slightly older kids. I think my teenagers and their friends, they seem to have wisened up, and
Okay,
they're onto it now, and
that's good.
in a way that, I mean, I will admit, in the 2005 or 2010 or whatever, my optimism for I was kind of a techno optimist,
Yeah,
um, and they've sort of wised up to these things, and they're paying more
yeah,
attention, and they
that's
know
good.
what's going on. But
That's
it
good.
still remains, as you say, it's an act of resistance.
Right,
Totally
right.
not. They like you have to. It's you have to guard against it. You're floating down this river in a canoe, and you have to constantly paddle against the current to
Right.
do
And
that.
then I just think like then I think more and more about like the people who are going to be intentional about these kinds of things. You just have to band together with other people who are like you. And that doesn't mean like necessarily isolate yourself from your community or neighbors, but make close connections with and form like sort of alliances or, friendships or whatever, colleagues with people who are in the same boat and like agree with your principles. And
Hmm.
I do think that there's like more strength in numbers with that too, but and also just being able to talk about it out loud. Like I'm in the thick of it now because my daughters just started going to public school in the United States. This is something I always was afraid of, like the influence of peers. And my oldest daughter is still asking for a phone. She's 10. And she had a friend come over, and I think only one of her friends who have come over has a cell phone. But the other one doesn't, this other one who came over doesn't. And I was saying, like, talking to her mom about it, like, okay, we're on the same page with this. Like, you just can't give them the phones. It's a slippery slope to social media. Even if they don't have social media, their friends will text them pictures from it. Like, you just have to keep them off of it completely. And so it was like finding your people and, like, making that personal connection.
The parents have to, ban on that topic in particular. And, I guess we're a bit ahead of you age-wise with the kids. And that was a big deal, finding enough parents who were like, hey, everybody's agreeing.
We're not doing this.
Not until this age is this a thing that's going to happen. Talking about children, I have to ask, I thought about it after we emailed initially, but you began your study of these topics long before you had children. And you have been writing about it and working in this space before having kids. And you have 3 kids, is that right?
Three girls. Yeah.
3 girls, and which is awesome. Say that like it's scary, but it's not. I love it. Scary. But so now you have children, and I gather they're all sort of single digits to low double digits.
Yeah. 10 and under. Yeah.
Has it changed your perspective?
I think it has really just sharpened the application. So by that, I mean, and I mean this with everything, I take a very iterative approach, as they say in, like, tech circles. I have a principle, I have how I want something to work in theory, and then I put that into practice, and it doesn't always work in practice, or I tweak it to make it work in our context, or with our own set of circumstances, or with our kids' personality, or that kind of thing. And so, like, for example, homeschooling is a perfect example. I started out when my oldest was a baby, and I got in touch with some friends who I, like, really admired their perspective and philosophy. And we had a lot of similar principles, who got into this thing called radical unschooling, which is basically like, you don't need to teach kids. They're going to learn on their own.
John Holt, wow, this is I guess is the.
Yes. John Holt is, like, the philosopher. And there's this woman, Sandra Dodd, who wrote a lot about it. And I read a bunch of this when she was a baby, and I was like, yes, I'm going to do this. And, like, yeah, of course. And then I was reading, like, Rousseau, I think it was Emile, who was like, the kids don't really need formal instruction until they're like 7 or 8. Then I was reading these studies about, in Finland, they don't do, like, formal, intentional reading education until their kids are 7. And by that, they mean if the kids are interested in reading, of course, and they read to them, but they don't make them, like, sit down and learn phonics until they're 7. And if they wait, the kids do actually better than being, like, forced to do phonics at, like, 4, 5, 6. So I was like, oh, okay. So, like, these early years, like, we should just play, blah, blah, blah. And that's true. And I still think that. But then once my eldest was, like, 7, 8, 9, and they were going to local school in Uruguay and doing fine. But it was obvious that my oldest was, like, falling a bit behind in reading in English, and she was reading fine in Spanish. But I was like, wait, I don't think this stuff just kind of comes to them unless you're intentional and you sit down and say, like, we're going to read in English and I'm going to teach you, like, these things intentionally. And then I just started to change a little bit my attitude of, like, approach towards homeschooling. And then I just thought, basically, like, they already went to the local school in Uruguay, but I never really took it that seriously. I just thought, like, we'll supplement at home. And we did supplement, and we did history lessons and some reading and some Charlotte Mason and all this kind of stuff. But anyways, long story short, we moved back to Chicago, and I just think, and this is, like, my iterative approach, maybe when I first had kids, I would think I'm homeschooling them all the way through. And now I think, like, the experience in public school is itself formative in a way that I think is really important, and was really important for me. So I went to Chicago public schools when I was a kid, and a lot of people say, like, oh my gosh, Chicago public schools are such a lost cause. And I can see that argument. I had the same argument when I moved my kids to Uruguay, partially for education reasons, because I was so afraid of Chicago public schools, like basically putting my kids on Adderall, which was the big thing at the time in 2013 or so, was like everyone with these kids are just getting medicated to death. And now I just think like it was actually wonderfully formative for me to be sort of forced to be in a classroom with people who are different from me, to make friends with them, to learn how to sort of be tolerant of a classroom setting, to have the discipline to get up every morning, to kind of go through the steps, but then also really beautifully, I don't know, like the sense of community and belonging that happens with like volleyball teams, the volleyball team, like my daughter's on the volleyball team, and like when they win even like a point, they're like screaming of joy, and like that belonging of like you're part of this local community and everybody is so different, but like we're here, we're showing up for this institution. Like, so anyways, like the question is, has your philosophy changed? Like some people on Twitter, when I was tweeting during the pandemic, like Chicago public schools were a complete mess during the pandemic. And I was following this because my family's from Chicago. And I was like, let's do this homeschooling class, you know, and I just brought all these people in. I'm like, all these people are coming into homeschooling. It's awesome. Like, I love homeschooling. And at the time during the pandemic, like knowing how to homeschool and being empowered to do so when things are so dysfunctional in the schools was a good thing and was an empowering thing. And so, but now I've switched and I'm just like, all right, like we gotta show up in our public schools, people, and people are like, who are you? Like, how have you, didn't you just like say the opposite? And so, but I'm like, I'm not going to get wedded to some philosophy if it's not, you know, it doesn't make sense or work in my life. Like I'm really just iterating on what I see in front of me and making the best decision I can. And so, you know, I don't make any real prescriptions. This is like part of my like subsidiarity is I don't want to make prescriptions for other people's lives. I'm still pro homeschooling a lot of cases. Like if you're going to do it, great. And it's way better than the public school and you find ways to do it and you find ways to make community and like that, make that work for you, go for it. But like in my situation right now, I'm like all in gung ho. I'm going to make this public school thing work and I'm going to try to show up for my kids with that.
I'm sure they feel that. I will often say I'm an anti-institutionalist, but I think you've made a really strong argument for maybe me tempering that a bit. And it's not that I'm an anti-institutionalist, but I do feel like I'm probably an hopeless institutionalist.
Yeah, right, exactly. And there are certain like just
or
really
ones
like,
that I cannot influence, ones that
yes, exactly. And actually,
you know,
a lot of people don't realize like the local public school. I had this in my calendar. Like there's a local school council that I wanted to go to the meeting yesterday, just like see what was up with it. And like these institutions, a lot of them, some of them seem like you can't make any difference at all in them, but it's surprising actually when you start to show up the extent to which you can make a big difference. Like even lead a Girl Scout troop, lead a Boy Scout troop, like the impact you will make on people's lives in your community and the connections you'll make and you help mold these young kids' lives. Like, you know, we need people showing up and not like dropping out of all institutions.
I'm kind of, I would say, and this is probably personality wise, I'm more inclined to be like, if the institution is not working, it's a lot easier to build a new one. And and that's just where, it's a lot easier probably to get 10 families who are interested in something special and create a new institution than try to change the institution that already has 4,000 kids enrolled in it from 3,000 families.
So I can actually speak on this for a second and something I wanted to get on the record for a while, which is in some cases.
Get on the record here on the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. I'll refer. People ask me these things, and then I can just refer back to this episode. Just go listen to minute whatever of this episode. So basically, I think it's a case by case basis. And the reason I say that, I'll take schooling as an example. If you live in a district where, for example, it's just, really beyond repair, and things are just, you cannot in good faith send your kid to that school and feel like they would be unharmed by going to that school. Then looking into making an alternative institution, like people make private schools all the time. That's not even that's not even that radical of a thing.
They used to found towns and create new
Right.
towns in which
Right.
they were.
Right.
Yeah.
But then the other thing I just want to caution against is there's just a cost benefit question there. And if, for example, like I know that my local public school, even though it's Chicago Public Schools, which is a huge behemoth, my local public school has like these openings on this local school council that I will probably run for at some point. And, not that many people want to do it. And you can determine a lot about how the school is run. You can get involved. You can put your stamp on things. You can make sure that things you disagree with, you voice your concerns about that and tell other parents about it. And I've read example after example of homeschooling co-ops or alternative schools, like trying to get off the ground and failing because it is actually really, really hard.
Oh, sure.
To figure out like an institution, like to figure out who is teaching, who is running the money, when did the kids show up, how, like a lot of the kids, I was just posting about this the other day, somebody was sharing these stories about somebody who was trying to make a homeschooling co-op in their local area, and it was like, oh, we have to be like calling people every morning. Oh, the kid didn't feel like coming today, and so we've got nobody showing up into the class. And then the parents started the infighting with like, how these things should be run, and there's no real governance structure. And it's actually quite similar to the attitude with like intentional communities. If only we could go to a perfect world in which everybody agrees, we'll just start from scratch and make an intentional community. But then what ends up happening is you don't have these governance structures or social norms or morals that have evolved through the years and centuries of tradition, starting all of those things from scratch and figuring out like governance, hierarchy, who's in charge, who is like doing the plumbing, like who is doing the dirty work, everybody wants to be the mayor, but like nobody wants to show up and be the teacher or the house cleaner or, make sure that the streets are swept or whatever. And there's no real structure for like who's in power and how they get power and how they, how their checks and balances and all this stuff. And I'm skeptical and pessimistic about a lot of people's utopian visions of new institutions, because I've traveled a lot, like I said, and a lot of my travels were in these intentional communities because I was working on organic farms through this organization called WOLF, the Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms. And of course, they're always in like communes and intentional communities. And I've seen so much dysfunction in these different communities because it's just sort of like people take advantage of power differentials to sort of exploit one another and this kind of thing. Not to say that that's like the case.
I mean, is the profile of person that is opting into that intentional community maybe not the profile of person who can most successfully start an organization? Is that a fair?
Well, that's the other question. Like, and for example, like I've known a lot of people, or I've known of at least half a dozen examples of people who have successfully started schools, but they were like, basically type A, business-minded, like super conscientious, organized people. And they sort of pulled rules from, already existing institutions and said like, I'm going to run this school, basically this charter like this other institution. And I'm just but it's going to be focused on this particular style of learning. And then that's a success. So like that would be an example where the cost benefit makes sense to do it in this way. But starting everything from scratch, like to me, is always a recipe for disaster. Like you've really got to pull from tradition.
Completely agree with that. I mean, and just startups of all kinds are very it's hard to start new things. I think it's hard to start new things, and new things need to be started at the same time. And so, it was Nassim Taleb who talks about he's always wanting, or not always, but he at one point, I think maybe jokingly suggested there should be a day where, like, a holiday where we honor entrepreneurs, because they're essentially martyrs. Because, like, when they start something from scratch, it is almost always going to be a disaster.
Yeah, right.
Like,
Right.
it is, and yet we need them to start things, or else that's providing the fodder and the ingenuity and the creativity and the innovation that sort of keeps things going on. Like, if you don't start new things, all you're left with are sclerotic, bloated, decaying institutions, unless you are constantly starting new things.
Yeah. I mean, think about it like ecosystem evolution. You've got these things just throwing themselves out into the universe to see if it'll work, and then failing miserably. And it's like, but I just think people should have a balance with when they're thinking about these things. Like, I think a lot of people will see some institution that has some problems, it's not even a failing institution. It just has problems that are obvious. And they're like, throw their hands up. We just need to start completely new. And there is a utopian impulse there that is in many ways extremely risky, in the sense that you are going to be potentially one of those people who's throwing your ideas or whole life and energy and family and whatever else into the risk of a new venture that might fail. And so you just have to think about, like, that risk reward, scenario, and where to best place your efforts. And you have to be very intentional about it. There's no real way around it.
I mean, it's, how do you make God laugh? You tell him your plans. Like, you have to recognize that whatever path you choose, the future's uncertain. Like,
right.
I mean, you began down a certain path 7, 8, I guess 3 or 4 years ago, or however long, and now you kind of are on, new direction. I'm interested to hear, and I hope we will, like, 5 years from now, after you're on the school board or you're having a leadership thing, and you're like, I'm interested to hear what you say about how the relative ease of starting something new versus having a positive impact on a very large, very established institution.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I'm sure that, like everything, I'll just be iterating and shifting as things go on. I can't know for sure, in advance how it's going to all turn out, but I'm going to, for example, the Daley family is the former mayor Daley. Was,
John Daley.
His dad, and then his dad, it was, they were like, all these Daleys are in power, and a lot of them still are. And one of them is our local city council person, which we call alderman here. And Patrick
in Chicago, or
in
politicians,
Chicago.
Are they influential? Do they have a lot of influence?
Yes, Chicago? Tons. And like,
I'm joking. They're kind of like,
and they're really like, I mean, but it's crazy because they're really like accessible. So Patrick just called this alderman, who is like the former mayor's brother, who's still in power, and asked him for a meeting, and asked him for connections. And it's really like amazing. But this is how politics works, and like, especially local politics, you start calling people, you make yourself known, and so we'll see, like, 5 years down the road, if I'm like totally disillusioned by local politics. But right now we're gearing up to just get involved into, like, all the local chamber of commerce organization, local school, local sports. Like, we're getting into all of it. And I'm just like, this is my local Chicago machine politics arc.
Well, now maybe is a good time. And you might have fully addressed it, like your return to Chicago, but it sounds to me like you're very much wanting to come back and grow where you were planted. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think, like, basically this is also kind of aligned with the discussion we had just now about, like, utopian thinking, which is, I think starting fresh in Uruguay and putting down roots. Like, we did build community there super easily. It was wonderful. Like, we still have many family friends there. We plan to go, we have our property still. I'm not 100% that I won't need a bug out location in the future. So I have a bug out location in South America.
I jokingly tell people that whenever there's crazy news and, floating around, I'm like, feels good to own some arable land in rural North Carolina.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Like, it's not going to hurt. We're still running trips. We're going to run trips down there as a way to bring our family back down and maintain connections. And so, it's wonderful. It was a wonderful experience there. But then, I did, and maybe this is like, I didn't have a strong enough colonizer mentality, but I did feel like down there that I didn't have the right to lean too far into wanting local power because I'm not from there, and I really shouldn't be the one who comes and says how this place should be.
Have you ever read? Have you read Ivan Illich's "To Hell with Good Intentions"? Have you ever read that essay?
No.
You were essentially. Do you know? Are you familiar with Ivan Illich?
Oh yeah.
I thought you were essentially about to quote from that essay. That's essentially what he was saying about, people kind of moving to, Central South America and, going to bring their, anyway, I totally interrupted.
That's funny. Yeah, no. But yeah, and I was just like, I would go to school meetings, but I just felt like they would ask for my opinion. And I was like, I don't even really know how these schools work, enough to even tell you how to run them. And so I just kind of felt like a little bit hamstrung. Like I can't kind of make the impact I would like to make in this local community because I'm not really from here and I'm missing a lot of context, cultural context. And it's odd for me to try to make some claims about what should be happening here. And so, going back to Chicago, I totally know these institutions. I know Chicago public schools in and out. I'm from this neighborhood. My husband's from this neighborhood. We know hundreds of people, just by name who we can call on and utilize and collaborate with. And so there's just so much more power in that. And then of course, the fun side, which is family relationships and helping take care of one another is also I think a lot of people underplay in an uncertain future. Preparedness is in these kinds of relationships and
agreed. And do y'all both have siblings and cousins?
Yeah, both have siblings and our parents. Yeah. Yep. And so then they have kids and we have cousins who we hang out with and they all have kids. And it's you want to have Patrick has his close family friends who they have 4 kids his age. And so they all have family. It's huge amounts of people who are deeply, deeply will show up for one another.
Yeah. There's a difference between friends and people who will, if you're, have a whatever,
if you have
schizophrenic breakdown and you're in a gutter out there, they're going to drive.
They'll pick you up. It's stuff where it's not just, the basics of friends playing with each other, but deeply, if you're in trouble, they will help you to get out, kind of thing. And they will look out for your kids and pull strings.
There's something about modernity, and I use that phrase and I like to use it as a disparagement, but that lulls people into believing they can be insulated from that need. They don't need it. They can have their own water bottle. They can just walk around with their own water. They'll be fine. They don't need it. You don't need it.
Yes, this is going back to the beginning of our conversation, which is I think it's a material abundance that makes people think they can sort of buy their way to safety. Yeah. And actually, it's funny because one of the people we had on our podcast, Brad Garrett's his name. He wrote a book about bunkers. And he was describing how these rich people would buy these bunkers.
I've heard an interview of him on a different podcast. That's so
fascinating. He's great. He's
fascinating.
Awesome. Yeah. And he's great. And that book is great. And he was saying how the rich people have these super expensive bunkers, but then in difficult scenarios, they were having a hard time hiring a helicopter pilot to get them there because you can't necessarily buy your way to everything. Sometimes you need to lean on non-market based, like, favors basically to get things in difficult situations. Like, look, this guy, I owe him one. And so I'm going to do this, even though I don't really want to do it. Like, pay me whatever you want. I'm a helicopter pilot. It's the middle of some sort of apocalyptic scenario. I'm not leaving my family. You can pay me whatever you want. I don't care. Money doesn't mean anything.
Totally. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I was had dinner with a few friends. I was traveling. I was in Austin, and I had one friend there, and we all went to dinner together. And one of the guys, he lives in Austin, is a tech crypto guy.
Yeah.
I kind of got the impression, and I hope he'll listen to this and take it with the good nature that I mean it. But he owns a ton of land in, I think, Wyoming or Montana or something. He bought a whole bunch of land, and he's built a house or whatever. He's put fences all around it, and he was talking about, like, oh yeah, I have my, like, if the shit hits the fan, I've got my place I can go, and I've got all my ammo, and I've got all those things. And he was complaining about how he has a poacher that comes onto his property. He's like, yeah, and I'm, get rid of that poacher and all those things. And I'm like, what are you going to do? Like, you go up there, you're going to be by yourself. Like, nobody knows you.
Yeah.
If things are really bad, do you think you're just going to go up there with your crypto and just be able to be okay? Like, no one's going to, like, well, that's not how it's going to work.
That's exactly right. And actually, this is totally, like, aligned with our earlier conversation about, like, whether or not to, I kind of, like, isolate yourself and be an individual who solves all the problems on your own in your little walled garden, or whether or not you are, like, embedded in something bigger than you. And Chris Ellis, who's writing the Prepper book with me, he's, like, really high up in the U.S. Army, and, like, basically does disaster preparedness for North America. And people always ask him, like, what is the one thing you need to get, or what are some things you need to get to be prepared? And his answer is always the cutest answer. It's, you need to get a dining room table and invite your neighbors over and invite them over for dinner. And, like, make friends with people and fight local, win local. Like, his attitude is, like, you're not going to survive in a fortress. Like, even if you're on some sort of property, how many men it takes to defend that property. Like, there's a reason in medieval times they would have these castles with walls that, like, had all these men having to defend. It's very hard to defend, like, property and land. And, like, the more you think about property, the more you think about, like, it has to be people, it has to be.
When I'm always like, the best thing you can do, is to know your neighbor, like, really know your neighbor. You don't have to all get along. You don't have to see everything eye to eye, but everybody needs to know that you'll look out for each other if you need it.
Yeah. And I just think, like, increasingly there's a slippery slope into thinking of, like, of isolationism as a solution to the many problems of modernity. And I just am, like, increasingly of the attitude that ask yourself first if there's some way in which you can add to the collective, add to civil society, before thinking first, like, how to protect. There's almost like what you're running away from versus what you're running toward mentality. Mm-hmm. Like, you protect yourself, protect your family. And, like, part of my move to Uruguay was, like, I just want to protect my kids from Adderall, like, forced Adderall, consumption. And now I'm like, what am I running toward? What do I want to see more of? Like, I'm not just running away from something.
I think the great thing about the neighbor, know your neighbor aphorism, whatever you want to call it, like, it's not just to do it because it's the safety protection thing. And actually, it's like, we as people, like, our special thing, like, the thing that makes us able to do all the things we do, we can cooperate and collaborate with other people. That's, like, our amazing thing that makes us great. And it's sort of what we were put here to do. It's to collaborate with our fellow humans to accomplish amazing things. And, like, in times of good or bad, it's the thing to do. And I kind of feel like, when I say, I don't know if I really believe this, but I'll say it, but I feel like the thing of, when I say modernity, I wonder if what I really mean is the forces of atomization, like the things that would want to break us apart or isolate us or make us out on our own or dependent on not interdependent. But
right. And it's actually, like, it's weird because it's, like, this vicious cycle where the things that atomize us the most are these institutions that then, we're also looking more and more to rely upon. And then we are like, well, we can't rely on these. So then, we're kind of on our own. And so we have that you get more and more atomized because these institutions that sort of have required your reliance are now themselves unreliable. And so it's like one of those things where it took away your ability to be self-reliant by relying on these different institutions, whether it's the state or the market. And then they became unreliable after they required you to rely on them. And then you are like, sort of stuck in this situation. Well, I guess I'm on my own. Instead of thinking, like, well, what are the ways in which I could reinvigorate not just self-reliance, but community reliance? And that's one of the main critiques of like a prepper mentality in general, is just like we just said, it's not just self-reliance. It's, how do we reinvigorate these human scaled, community self-reliance and ability to provide for ourselves, kind of thing.
It reminds, I ought to be able to quote this Bible verse, but I can't remember it offhand, but it's essentially, when you have a disagreement with your neighbor, the first thing you should do is go to your neighbor and talk to them. Yeah. And then if your neighbor won't listen, you should bring a friend and go to your neighbor. And if the neighbor won't listen, you should bring several and talk to them. And then if that is if the last resort, you go to your rabbi and involve the authority in it. And we have a tendency, I think, in modernity to skip the whole neighbor part. Yeah. Skip the whole friend part and just go straight to the authority to resolve your problem.
Exactly.
And I need to be able to know that quote. I wanted to ask you, it's a bit related, but you have gifted me one of my favorite memes of all time, and it's the spreadsheet brain meme.
Yeah.
It seems like it might be your favorite meme. Is that true?
It's probably, yeah. Somebody made me I forget who made me the actual picture of a guy with like a tumor on his head and the Excel logo inside of it. And it's, and his brain is like bleeding.
And then the words inoperable below it.
Yeah, inoperable.
And the doctor's kind of sad, like, oh, well.
Yeah. It's like, you're done. But yeah, basically, like, I'm an environmental sociologist. I know how a lot of these environmental sociologists like quantitatively come to conclusions. I was just talking to a man today who helped like develop the ecological footprint. And many of these people are like, they think they're very, very well-meaning in the sense of like, they just want to be able to understand social problems or, understand things that are really hard to wrap your head around in the world in which we live, where things are so overskilled and so globalized. So they just want like simple metrics to be able to understand things and like fully assess them. So I don't blame them for the impulse, but then what ends up happening is people completely ignore their intuition and will literally not believe their own eyes in favor of data and spreadsheets. And it's like, dude, look at your own eyes. It's like the George Monbiot argument of like, literally look at a lab that makes this kind of stuff. Look at what it looks like and look at what a small farm looks like. And tell me which one of these is sustainable.
Look at the landscape totally covered, what was once, pasture forest, totally covered with solar fields. And just look at that.
Just use your intuition. And then eventually, this is part of Chris Mage wrote this rebuttal to Monbiot, and he's basically like, I could argue with him on the spreadsheets all day and win. But also at a certain point, we need to get off the spreadsheet argumentation and literally ask questions about what kind of life we want to live, what kind of quality matters, where are our morals, where is beauty? And that beauty doesn't go on a spreadsheet. It just simply is not quantifiable in that way. Just sometimes we just need to open our eyes. And so that this is my pushback against all the respect in the world to people who are like quantitatively inclined, but don't rely on this kind of thing as a crutch to like make an argument against beauty and sustainability and morality. I'm just not going to stand for it. Open up your eyes.
I'm glad you were. I'm glad you're making that argument, and I'm really grateful for the work that you are doing. Uh, this is probably a great place to wrap up. Ashley, I will let you sort of remind people where they can find you.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Rhizoma School. I'm not doing a ton of activities at the moment. I'm still running the field school. So if you're at a university who wants to run a trip, we're going to start running trips in the United States and the
So, and
Midwest.
to be clear, that's like for the Rhizoma field school trips, they tend to be university classes,
University,
summer
yeah. So
programs.
tend to be universities who like you can either run a class, a credit bearing trip, or you could run like a service learning trip, which is a sort of like volunteer, sort of like a alternative spring break is the kind of thing that they do.
How young is it all university level? Do you do high school level?
University, but we're open to doing high school, but just the universities a lot of times just have the infrastructure to do it. But I know of some high schools who do like service learning trips too. So rhizomafieldschool.com, we're going to start running trips in the US. We've got a lot of people doing really beautiful, cool, human scale, sustainable, like regenerative agriculture, regenerative businesses that I'm like really excited to run trips. We're specifically going to start trips in the driftless region of Wisconsin, and it's going to be, there's so many people doing really cool stuff there. And then, maybe we'll branch out to Appalachia, different places. And so rhizomafieldschool.com, and then Doomer Optimism, you can just Google us. We'll be up on, YouTube and all the places where you get podcasts. Right. We're continuing on with that project.
I love that project. Ashley, thank you so much. It's been a delight to meet you.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. Great conversation. Right. Thanks, Jeff, for the invite.